The fall of France, as well as Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands in just a few weeks in 1940 was unexpected and titanically shifted the world situation. The United States was suddenly facing the very real possibility that we might be the last great democracy left, surrounded on all sides by enemies. But the nation was not at all on a war footing and lacked even basic military production. We were not even able to supply our army with sufficient rifle ammunition. And thus began what was possibly the largest industrial transformation in the history of the United States. In rural Wisconsin, the largest munitions factory in the world sprang up as if from nowhere. One of the many military facilities, training bases, supply depots, airfields, some the size of small cities that transformed the nation, built to meet the demands of a global war. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
In May of 1940, the same month that Germany began its lightning invasion of Western Europe, America was learning just how unprepared they were. According to the War Department, the U.S. Army was almost hopelessly unprepared. The country lacked enough anti-aircraft guns to defend a single American city. What artillery they had was still mostly mounted on wooden wheels, could only be towed by horse or mule. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge bemoaned that I have recently seen all the tanks in the United States, about 400 in number, or about one finger of the fan-like German advance. Those tanks were nearly all light tanks. About the only bright part of the report was that the Army had enough rifles and machine guns, but hardly enough bullets, bombs, or artillery shells. More weapons and ammunition would take time to make. One senator complained that the Army's ambition is to get ready in a period of 18 or 24 months, when we are living in a period of wars being settled in 30 days. It was not true that the country had done nothing to prepare for war. In 1937, the Army had established an office in Delaware that studied the capacity of the nation's existing munitions plants and prepared estimates of future demand. In collaboration with the DuPont and Hercules corporations, the office developed plans for smokeless powder and high-explosive plants and selected possible sites for new factories. In 1940 and 41, 6 sites were chosen for new smokeless powder plants. Instead of adding on to existing plants, the government planned to build numerous plants by contracting out to American companies in various locations around the country. The benefits would be twofold. First, spreading out the factories made it more difficult for an enemy to shut down production, and it brought jobs to more communities still suffering from the Depression. 1940 and 41 saw 77 industrial facilities contracted as government-owned, contractor-operated. Hercules Powder Corporation built a number of the facilities, including beginning in 1940 the Radford Army Ammunition Plant in southwest Virginia. Hercules was contracted to build another plant on the same plan at another site in the Sauk Prairie in Sauk County, Wisconsin. Before the war, the Army had been stockpiling manufacturing equipment in anticipation of construction of the factories. The Army had already developed criteria for the best sites. They should be away from metropolitan areas, in close range to a large volume water supply, have a good source of electrical energy, be close to rail and highways, 250 miles from the national border, and have a source for workers. The Sauk County site met most of these requirements. By the summer of 1941, the construction division of the Army Quartermaster General requested information about the site, and papers reporting that a plant would be built near Merrimack, Wisconsin, appeared in late October, when Representative William H. Stevenson, who represented the area, was allowed to make the decision public. This particular location was selected because it is ideal for powder work, Stevenson said. The announcement was not met with support from the locals. The area had been settled in the 1840s and was particularly fertile farmland. The Army argued that the good soil of the area was important to the project, which is why less useful land had been skipped over. Years after the plant had been built, a government source explained that there were special interests involved as well. Bud Williams, president of the Northwestern Railroad, had a rail line in the area and hoped to generate business in the Baraboo area. The site had more than 800 houses and other buildings across 74 farms, 26 cottages and residents, 3 schools, 3 churches, the Sumter Town Hall, and even 3 cemeteries. Many of the families had lived in the area for generations. The farmers protested and even organized to press the government to find a new location. They suggested other locations, such as in the town of Stanley in the western part of the state and in Barksdale in the northern part of the state. Adams County was especially interested in the factory and was less developed. In nearby Baraboo, the reaction was more positive. The average person was pretty happy about it, Floyd Allen, a local resident, recalled. For the people here in town, it was going to be a big thing, a big economic boom. Protests aside, the government never seems to have seriously considered another location. Probably the decisive event was the attack on Pearl Harbor, which caused the farmers to cease their opposition. The farmers would have to wait for their payment because most farmers chose to determine compensation through the condemnation proceedings, which didn't conclude until 1943. The farmers were fully paid by the end of 1944. Hercules was contracted to build the plant as a virtual copy of the Radford plant. By November 10, 1941, the company was authorized to begin surveys and design work for the Badger Ordnance Works. By mid-November, investigation had begun, and the commanding officer of the Ordnance Department, Major George Griffith, arrived on January 8, 1942. 6 days later, the first field office was established, and by March, work began on building the plant on more than 10,500 acres that had been acquired by the government. Contracts at the time allowed for just 12 months for the plant to be constructed and ready for production. In addition to Hercules, the Mason and Hanger Company of New York was contracted for architect engineering management service. Subcontractors were quickly hired to accomplish the Herculean task. 146 firms ultimately completed 116 contracts for Mason and Hanger. Baraboo was the largest nearby town, and it was soon swamped with workers. Construction workers came largely from other places, Ellen remembered. The workers built around the clock, 7 days a week, receiving the 8th day off. By May of 1942, numerous buildings had gone up. Roads and rail had been built. This included barracks for workers, numerous plant buildings such as the clock alleys where workers clocked in and out and changed houses. The construction crew peaked in August of 1942 when 12,000 people were working on constructing more than 1,400 buildings. Workers stayed anywhere that there was space, spare rooms, attics, and trailers. A trailer camp was set up in Prairie du Sac, while Jamaican workers were segregated into a civilian conservation corps camp. The plant was laid out with exacting specifications. Each production line was self-contained and connected to other parts of the plant via access roads and rail lines. The more dangerous the work, the more clear space that there was around the building, so that any explosion would be limited in its effect. To avoid the possibility of fire hazards from electrical equipment, light fixtures were often mounted on a building's exterior, with the light coming through ground glass windows. The buildings were designed to be built quickly and generally for temporary use on concrete slabs. Depending on their specifications, each had doors, windows, ventilators, and other necessary fixtures of standard design and of a type which could be furnished by any mill. There were some special considerations for buildings that would handle acid or finished powder, and floors were often covered with lead or conductive rubber. Buildings where explosions were possible were specifically built to confine or direct those potential explosions. This included walls meant to blow out, as well as separating the interiors with concrete or brick barrier walls. To ease the problem of housing, Badger Village was constructed. It had thin walls, but this small village had a post office, school, child care facilities, and even a grocery store. Shifts were expected to be so large that construction on Wisconsin's first 4-lane rural highway began early in the process, possibly as early as March or April 1942. While the work was owned by the government, it was largely operated by the Hercules Corporation as a Class II, government-owned, contractor-operated installation. The primary difference between an ammunition plant and an ordnance plant is that the ordnance plant does not manufacture actual cartridges, but the raw materials necessary to make the cartridges. The works also conducted reliability tests on its product before it could be sent to ammunition factories for use in cartridges and other ammunition. The Badger Ordnance Works largely produced smokeless powder, a propellant necessary for artillery and firearm ammunition that produces significantly less smoke than black powder. The plant was meant to make single-base smokeless powder, which uses nitrocellulose as the sole propellant ingredient. A revision to the initial plan added double-base powder lines, which is smokeless powder that uses both nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin as a base, as well as lines to produce TNT. Lines for TNT were begun but abandoned. Double base lines would be built on their foundations in 1944. The first part of the plant that was operational was an acid production area, which began producing acid on January 8, 1943, about 10 months after the beginning of construction. The first production was of 40% oleum, also known as fuming sulfuric acid, used in explosives manufacture. The plant began producing smokeless powder on January 23, 1943. Nitric acid was made on site and then used to treat cotton to make nitro-cotton, which was the basis of smokeless powder. On May 10th, the plant shipped its first trainload of smokeless powder, 60,000 pounds of it, to the Twin Cities Ordnance Plant in Minnesota, where it was used to make cartridges for M1 rifles. Throughout the war, the plant produced smokeless powder in 4 lines. In 1944, a second period of significant construction began when the War Department decided to add rocket propellant lines to the production. Towards the end of the war, the Army was using 18 million pounds of rocket propellant a month. The rocket propellant was double-base powder and involved mixing the nitrocotton with nitroglycerin, which was also made on site. Production of rocket grain began before construction was complete. According to Floyd Allen, the nitroglycerin production was the most dangerous part of the job, and he recalled an accident where a nitroglycerin building blew up. There was 4 men in it at the time, and all they could find was bits and pieces, he said. The workforce at the plant peaked at around 6,600, although employment depended on demand. Workers worked around the clock in 3 shifts. During all periods of operation, a significant number of Native Americans were employed from local tribes. Like many wartime factories, a large portion of the plant's workforce were women. Officials at the plant told women that a powder plant is the 14th safest industry in which to work, being much safer than housekeeping. Jamaicans and Barbadians were also brought in to satisfy the plant's employment needs. Between 1942 and 1945, construction crews laid more than 4 million square feet of floor space, 77 miles of new roadway, 26 miles of railroad track, 65 miles of sewer line, and 216 miles of electrical wires. According to figures from the War Department, reported by the War Department in 1945, construction at the Badger Ordnance Works cost more than $127 million. Victory in Europe in May 1945 hardly slowed production, but on August 13th, a directive was sent to cease construction based on new estimates of a quick end to the war in the Pacific. On September 7th, the plant was put on standby and staff was reduced to a small force to maintain the facilities. Construction on new parts of the plant, including a 5th smokeless powder line, were left incomplete. During the war, the Badger Ordnance Works produced almost 260 million pounds of smokeless powder to supply the military and 13 million pounds of rocket grain. The war's end saw the facility left to excess federal property status.
But that was not the end of production for the Ordnance Works that later became known as the Badger Army Ammunition Plant. War in Korea and then Vietnam saw the plant reactivated, and it was a vital production facility for both of those conflicts. The construction of the plant was part of a much larger construction project that in a matter of mere months transformed the country in order to meet the enormous task of supplying an unprecedented war effort. As William Knutson, who was director of production under the Undersecretary of War, put it, "We won because we buried the enemy under an avalanche of production the likes of which he had never seen, nor dreamed possible."
The Badger plant was officially declared excess to the Army's needs in 1997, and since then nearly all of the buildings that housed the production works have been demolished. The Badger History Group maintains a museum called the Museum of Badger Army Ammunition, located at S7560 U.S. Highway 12, North Freedom, Wisconsin, between Sauk City and Baraboo. Admission to the museum is free, however, donations are accepted. The museum is run by volunteers, including and especially the president and curator of the Museum of Badger Army Ammunition, Verlyn Mueller. Verlyn worked at the plant for 26 years, 16 years in maintenance and the last 10 as an engineer. Is almost 85 years old, is in the museum 5 days a week, and has the part-time help of other volunteers to do the work of preserving this incredible story. Other volunteers come in 1 or 2 days a week, and some as needed or when available.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.